Have you ever watched some of your favorite films and wondered how they got such clean, beautiful images? You look at these really dark, moody scenes and you realize that they're beautifully shot and they have zero noise. Then you go ahead and you try to shoot one of these dark, moody scenes and you end up with grainy, noisy footage that is impossible to color and just ends up looking like straight up garbage. The first few years of my career, it felt like it was impossible to shoot a dark and moody scene until I understood ISO. And today I'm going to break down and demystify all the common misconceptions that most filmmakers have about ISO. There are three aspects of exposing your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. While aperture and shutter will affect how much light is actually coming into your camera and hitting your sensor, your ISO is just boosting that light captured by the sensor, which essentially adds gain and therefore degrades your overall image quality. And I know that might sound confusing, so let's quickly break this down. You have natural light in a room, then you have your aperture, which controls obviously your iris and how much light you're letting in, and then you have your shutter, which also affects how much light you're letting into your sensor. And then you have ISO that comes in after that boosts or amplifies that signal. Now, I really hope that made sense to you guys, and if it doesn't, drop some comments down below and I will try my best to help make sense of this. Properly exposing your image is a balancing act, and there's definitely a give and take, especially when it comes to setting your ISO. In fact, one of the most common misconceptions is that every camera deals with ISO the same, but that's actually not true at all. Every camera comes with a native ISO and some come with a dual native ISO. This is typically where your camera performs best when it comes to dynamic range and color performance. So let's take my FX3 for example. I have a dual native ISO of 800 and 12,800. And one of the reasons why this camera is so powerful is because the ISO performance makes it extremely versatile. But that also doesn't mean that I should always just set my camera to 12,800 and, throw an ND filter and run around and expose for that. Because there are times when it's better to shoot 800 and there are times when it's better to shoot 12,800. But all that to say, I highly suggest that you guys figure out what your native ISO in your camera is and test out the different ISOs to see how well your camera performs in low light at different ISOs and in bright lighting conditions with different ISOs. Another common misconception, and something that I wasn't really aware of, especially early on in my career, and that was lowering the ISO in brighter lighting conditions and then hiring the ISO in lower light conditions. And this was actually ruining my films. What I typically do now is I'll set my camera to its native ISO, and I'm usually shooting on my Ursa Mini Pro, which is the native ISO is 800, and I'll expose my camera for using 800 ISO. And because your shutter speed should typically be double your frame rate, and because I shoot in 24 frames or I might shoot in 60 frames, it's either going to be 50 or 120. That leaves only one of two options. Either I can lower the aperture to let more light into my camera, or I have to bump up the exposure or the lighting levels of my scene to properly expose my scene. And if I'm outside in really bright conditions, I'll use an ND filter. But if I'm in a really low light situation, I'll raise the natural light in the room so that more light is hitting my sensor and I'm retaining all the information I need to be able to properly expose my image and have as much detail in my shadows as possible. Now, in an attempt to better explain this, have you guys ever looked at a behind the scenes of one of your favorite films and you notice a scene that they're shooting that you realize in the film is a lot darker, but in the behind the scenes there's like a ton of lights and what they're actually showing you is something super bright, but in camera it looks a lot darker? That's because they don't just light a scene and then they go, oh, okay, the scene's a little dark, let's just bump the ISO up. No, instead they leave the ISO, most likely the native ISO of the camera, and then they add natural light to properly expose for the image. But then the question still remains, right? Like, how do you properly expose for your image? That's where the term exposing to the right comes in. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen different tutorials online with, other filmmakers talking about how all you have to do is higher your ISO and then exposed to the right. Like I said, coming back to the beginning, ISO is something that amplifies the light coming into your camera sensor. It's not actually adding light into your camera sensor. The best and most natural way of doing that is to either A, lower your aperture to let more light in, or B, add more lights to your scene so you could properly expose for that image. So if you guys think just because you have a Sony FX3 and you could bump up your camera to 12,800, that doesn't always mean that that's the right thing to do. It really depends on what your image calls for. There's no one size fits all. So really quickly, let me break this down. Certain cameras will perform better with their highlights if you bump up the ISO higher. You'll retain more information into your highlights because you're gonna make sure that those highlights don't clip. However, you will have a little bit more grain in your mids and your shadows. So you have to kind of determine what's the most important part of your image. Do you want to retain most of the shadows and the lowlights in your image? Then you're going to want to use a lower ISO. Now, if you want to retain a lot of that highlight information and most of your image lives in those midtones and the highlights and there's not so much shadow in your image, then your best bet might be to shoot with a higher ISO in order to retain that information so nothing clips. Taking a look at this scene that I shot for one of my documentaries, I knew that most of the information that I wanted to retain was all in the shadows. So I set my camera to its native ISO of 800 and I overexposed by 1 stop, knowing that I would bring down all the shadows and the blacks to give me this really dark, rich looking image. But just like with anything, there's a give and take. You could obviously see the light tubes on the cage just clipped and I missed a little bit of that information. Now, to me, it was more important to make sure that I had the information in the shadows and in all the dark spots of the scene so I could properly color grade this, because the overall image was going to live in the shadows and in the blacks. So ultimately, like I said before, there's always a give and take, and you have to look at the information in your image and figure out not only how to properly expose your image, but what ISO would retain the information that would give you the best results. I know a lot of this ISO stuff could be very confusing, so this is my best attempt to try to help you guys understand this. Of course, if you have any questions, drop some comments down below and I will try to help you guys as much as I possibly can. I want to thank you guys so much for stopping in and hanging out, and yeah man, I'll see you guys next week. Deuces.